Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Stephen Groost from the South African Institute of International Affairs. We're just going to wait 1 minute for attendees to join. So sit tight and we'll start in a minute. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stephen Groost from the South African Institute of International Affairs. I head up our African Governance and Diplomacy program and also our Russia-Africa project, which has been running since the beginning of last year, and we'll conclude it early next year and hopefully have another phase of research. I'm delighted to be emceeing today and to be coming to you live from from Lagos in Nigeria, where I am at the moment. And we have a running order of how today's going to unfold. But if for some reason my connection doesn't work, Martha Bridgman will take over. We have a plan B. So hopefully it has been stated. I think we'll be doing well. So early in the year, Martha approached me and said, would you be interested in helping guest edit a journal of an edition of the South African Journal of International Affairs that looks at Russia's involvement in Africa? And we had barely started our program a year before, and I said, absolutely. I think there is a shortage of academic articles on this subject. There are newspaper pieces and some things from think tanks, but in terms of something that's gone through rigorous academic peer review, there was a real dearth. And of course, this was just before the invasion. I'd already started doing quite a lot of radio and TV interviews. And when the war struck on the 24th of February, I think we were really well placed and well timed with this call for the special edition. And we got quite a good response, and we are very happy to have produced the papers that we have that are quite wide-ranging, looking from private military contractors to how Russia and Africa have been interacting in the Horn of Africa and East Africa, and we'll hear from a number of the authors today. I'd like to also just thank, before I forget, Dr. Maxine Rubin, who is assisting Martha, and Maxine was one of the people who brought this idea to us from the International Relations and Diplomacy Research Committee of the South African Association of Political Scientists. It's also been a pleasure working with my co-editors, Kaylee and Sam, who you'll hear from a little bit later. But Africa matters in this war, and Russia's involvement with Africa is multifaceted, multi-layered, and really going at different paces in different places. For us in Africa, I think the 3 F's have become very apparent since the beginning of the war: food, fertilizer, and fuel. And the effects of a war far away have been deeply felt on our continent. A couple of weeks ago, I was also involved in a scenario building exercise with an American institution that was looking at 4 scenarios for what happens to this to Russia's engagement in Africa, depending on how the conflict goes. And there were 4 scenarios, loosely called the status quo, where things stay much the same, the bare hamstrung, where Russia is basically losing the war, one where Russia wins, and one where Africa is resilient and is able to take charge of its own agency. And it would be interesting to see which one of those you think we are headed for. It's also, I also recently returned from a trip to Addis Ababa to the African Union, and I was really struck by how little this was on the radar of African policymakers at the AU. It was not a top of mind issue. So, you know, does this war really matter to Africa? But we've got a really great set of papers with novel insights, longevity, and they all have something to say. I'm going to now hand over to Martha Bridgman, the editor of the South African Journal of International Affairs. Martha.
Thanks very much, Steve. I am so pleased to be seeing this issue launched. I think it's covering some critical questions that have arisen in the course of the Russia-Africa program that SAIA is running, but also coming from the academic community. I'm seeing the level of interest and the level of urgency in addressing some of the questions. I would just like to give a broader overview to mention that we have 2 of the papers represented on the panel today, but in fact there are 8 papers, 8 articles that have been through the whole peer review process and are now, some of them have been released on the website. You might see a few of them will be open access, others free to view for a temporary period. But we're hoping that there will be a great engagement with the papers that come out, and people will really begin to think through some of the issues that are mattering at this moment. And some of the issues that are not covered by the panelists today include questions of the perceptions of Russia's return to Africa, and that is based on empirical research in West Africa, the private military diplomacy of Russia in Africa. And of course, this cuts across many of the discussions that we'll have today, but there is a paper that focuses on what they call the Kalashnikov diplomacy, looking at the quest for influence through public diplomacy by Russia in Africa, and then some very targeted regional studies looking at the Horn and looking at Southern Africa through different lenses. So I'm thrilled that we were able to pull together this many papers. It is a critical issue. We also have book reviews that I believe readers will find very valuable. One of them is on Dr. Samuel Ramani's recent book, looking at Russia and Africa. And I think in general, this issue will contribute greatly to the discourse. So I'm very excited to hear the panelists today. And back to you, Steve, to introduce the first few panels. Maybe just house rules wise, the Q&A time, we're going to have a short Q&A following the first panel presentation, which is in fact pre-recorded because our speaker, one of them is in Liberia. And then we will have a response from Sam Ramani and then Q&A. So you can begin by typing, even as you listen, some of your questions into either the chat function or the Q&A box on your screen. Please, if you note anything, if there are problems with sound, you can put a hand up and one of the hosts will try to accommodate you. Okay, over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Martha. So our first panel is entitled Russia's Return to Africa in a Historical and Global Context, Anti-Imperialism, Patronage, and Opportunism. And we have the 2 authors of that particular paper who I'm going to tell you about now. First, Dr. Allard Duursma. Allard Duursma is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. His research focuses on how mediation and peacekeeping can help to prevent and end armed conflict with a regional focus on Africa. He also studies the transnational dimensions of armed conflict in Africa, as well as the involvement of Russia in Africa. He completed his PhD at the University of Oxford in 2015. His work has been published in domain-specific journals like the Journal of Peace Research and the Journal of Conflict Resolution, but also in general audience journals like International Studies Quarterly and International Organization. He is a deputy editor at International Peacekeeping, a permanent contributor to Political Violence at a Glance, and coordinates the Conflict Research Society Book of the Year Prize. His co-author is Nicholas Mazur. Nicholas Mazur is a senior researcher and military analyst at the think tank of the Center for Security Studies of the Swiss Federal Institution of Technology in Zurich. His research focuses on Russia and NATO military modernization efforts, as well as dynamics and lessons of ongoing conflicts and wars. He received an MA in Strategic Studies from the University of Reading, and I'm absolutely delighted to hear what they are going to say. So over to you, Maxine, to start the video.
One.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present our paper for this special issue. I think it's very exciting and very needed to have a special issue on this topic. And so today, Nicholas and I will talk about our paper. And the motivation of this paper is ongoing debate about the extent of Russian involvement or Russian power projection in Africa. So we started talking about this topic a couple of years ago, and we noticed that there are sort of two sides in this debate. So on the one hand, Russian return to Africa is seen as a grave security threat. So, for example, former AFRICOM commander General Stephen Townsend referred to Russia's malign influence in Africa as the second biggest threat to the US security interests in Africa after terrorism. On the other hand, there are those that sort of downplay the influence of Russia in Africa. So, for example, most notably, Kimberly Martin, she argues that actually the extent of Russian involvement in Africa is not that great in comparison to, for example, the United States, European Union, and China. And another example maybe is Sudan, a case that I know well, where actually Russia has been involved, but many observers note that this influence is quite small, for example, in comparison to the influence of Gulf states. But undeniably, Russia has returned to Africa. So as you can see, it's this picture where it was a summit between Russia and African leaders. So we can agree that Russia has returned. But the extent of the influence is of course, still a question mark. And Nicholas and I started discussing this, and actually we thought it was fruitful to take a step back. So when we had these discussions, we thought, well, wait a minute, what is actually the nature of the involvement of Russia rather than the influence? And we think this is a first step that should be taken in this debate. So really trying to contextualize Russian involvement in Africa. And of course, we are actually quite modest in our article. So we try to provide a snapshot and conscious of uncertainties, future uncertainties. And this is especially an important point we would like to stress in relation, of course, to the war in Ukraine, which I think makes this topic more important, but also knowing which direction Russian involvement in Africa goes in the future becomes also more uncertain. So what we would like to do today is contextualize Russian involvement in three steps. So first, we want to look at the Russian-Soviet legacy and how the UN or how Russia cashes in on this legacy. Then we look at Russia's rulership architecture, and then Nicholas will look at the global context and have a discussion and an outlook. So with regard to the Soviet past, I think it's quite interesting that in Africa, in the early 1960s, when many African states gained independence, a strong non-alignment norm emerged. So most African leaders in this period want to prevent Africa from being caught up in the superpower rivalry. So if you look at the Organization of African Unity Charter, for example, non-alignment is really explicitly mentioned as a strong norm. But on the other hand, of course, in this period, there was also, by most African leaders, there was a strong desire to liberate Africa from colonial powers like Portugal, but also in Southern Africa, where you had still apartheid regimes. So Soviet support for the liberation movements was welcomed. So and Russia, interestingly, really cashes in on this legacy of supporting liberation struggle. So this is sort of the what we would say is the ideational side of why Russia is able to punch above its weight, and Russia does so consciously. So a quite interesting document, a series of documents were leaked There's a hyperlink in the PowerPoint presentation, linked to a Guardian article published in June 2019, where these leaked documents were discussed. And one of the documents that's being discussed is how Russia tries to support an African self-identity based on anti-imperialism. And anti-imperialism is really seen as, I think, anti-Western, as an integral part of the Pan-African school of thought. So Russia really actively promotes anti-imperialism, or maybe anti-West, as a way to undermine Western influence in Africa. So this is more the ideational side. But there are, I think, two differences between the Soviet and the Russian involvement in Africa that are worth stressing. So during the Cold War, Russia really focused on countries or states that where the West also had strong interest, for example, Angola. It seems that when Russia returned, the focus was more pragmatically and more on countries that are ignored by the West, for example, the Central African Republic. Maybe Mali is an exception in this regard, but that's also a question mark and something we can discuss during the discussion. But there are, for example, rumors that Russia or the Wagner Group has been heavily involved in Mali, but maybe there are rumors that Wagner is also withdrawing because they are needed in Ukraine. So this is very much a question mark. But what is clear is that there is a much less state-centric approach to the Russian involvement. And this brings me back to not an ideational point, but more the material side of Russian involvement in Africa. So we argue in our article that Russia's use of a patronage-based strategy is really a natural fit to gain influence in Africa. So Alex de Waal, for example, has some work on Sudan, where he describes Sudan as a political marketplace in which local elites seek to obtain the highest reward for their loyalty within these patronage-based systems. Marie-Joëlle Zahar and Delphine Michelin reflect on how elites in the Central African Republic have consistently used all their means at their disposal to buy the loyalty of potential rivals. So there's really strong patronage-based systems. And actually, it's quite interesting that this literature on patronage in Africa, there's also a similar literature on Russia. They use and this is usually referred to as Putin's solar system. So different. So it's defined as a highly personalized network of different constituencies and personalities. So state and patronage really overlap, and this makes it very compatible with doing business in Central African Republic, Sudan, Libya, Zimbabwe, where Russia or Russia-related actors within this broader patronage network do business in these patronage networks in Africa. So this really makes it a natural fit, and we argue that it allows Russia to punch above its weight. Where some have noted that there's actually a weakness of Russia and Africa, that it's like highly personalized networks, we would argue that it's actually a strength. For example, in the Central African Republic, where Russian actors, Wagner Group and other actors have mining deals in the Central African Republic, and these are semi-state deals. So having outlined this, I now hand over to my colleague, Nicholas.
Thank you. As Alad already alluded to, a lot of Russian activities on the ground in Africa are actually run through semi-state networks. A lot of it is tied up in the network of Yevgeny Prigozhin, a Russian businessman who made his money originally in catering, and now in recent years, or since 2014, has already branched out into mercenary networks. And in this network, the so-called Wagner Group is by far the most prominent one. It's used a bit like Blackwater was for a while in the West as an umbrella term for a large group of, or for a conglomerate of mercenaries. Some of them may have less of a connection to Prigozhin and to the Kremlin than others, but it really is a patchwork, and something that is a decisive difference to, say, Western PMCs is that those Russian PMCs don't act against Kremlin priorities. So while they sometimes may act on their own accord and to their own economic benefit, a lot of what they do is actually, or we have to assume that the Kremlin has at least veto power and has the ability to conscript those mercenaries when it deems it of its strategic interest. But again, this is also one of the reasons why we've observed this Russian opportunism in Africa of going into the places where they've perceived a power vacuum. And something that goes back to some extent to the to what was mentioned at the top, which is the statements by AFRICOM, is that, or by former AFRICOM commanders, is that there really does not seem to be a Russian playbook or an overall Russian master plan, but it really is a bit of a patchwork. However, even in the activities of those semi-state networks and paramilitary groups, we can observe certain strategic priorities that are mirrored in power projection by the Russian state in other places of the world. So, for instance, and of course, all of this is before the invasion of Ukraine, and we'll get onto that on the last slide. But previously, for instance, in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, Russia initially tried to achieve a strategic effect in eastern Ukraine by funneling in mercenaries like precursors of the Wagner Group, and by really not involving the official military. Now, that did not work militarily, and so Russia upped the ante and deployed mechanized formations. It's also one approach that we've observed or that can be observed in Syria and in Libya. And militarily speaking, one of its key components has been to use local proxies like militia, local mercenaries, local regular forces in the case of Syrians, for instance, to do most of the fighting, whereas Russian special forces and Russian mercenaries have been doing training and coordination backed up in Syria and in Libya, of course, by Russian air power. And one term that has been used to view Russia's, or through which Russian interventions can be viewed, is this idea of reasonable sufficiency. In the West, it would be called, or in Western military parlance, it would be called low-cost, high-impact operations. And the idea really is for Russia to maximize strategic effects at as low a cost as possible. And interestingly, that is a priority that can be observed in those semi-state networks as well. And a second element that where we've got this overlap of Russian strategic culture, of the Russian state, if you will, and these networks, is a holistic approach to strategy, in the sense that we've not only got military components, but we also got political and information operations components. Again, going back to Syria as an example, what was observed there were so-called reconciliation centers that really acted like mediation cells, or like the West would use mediation cells for. But in the Russian case, those, while there was mediation going on, also these cells were collecting human intelligence to feed into Russian targeting cycles to then target Syrian opposition forces. And what could also be seen in the Central African Republic, for instance, and in Sudan, I think, was the use of information operations, specifically to move online discourse in favor of Russia, where Russia really has capitalized on those narratives of being a non-colonial power and on those post-Soviet legacies. In order to spread its narratives, if you will. And in the Central African Republic, of course, these paramilitary elements that have caught a lot of the attention are only one element in a broader political entrenchment campaign in favor of the incumbent president. So in that sense, this again also mirrors what the Russian, or how the Russian military thinks it would conduct power projection in many ways. So to sum up and to provide a bit of an outlook, perhaps, for one, there really does not seem to be a Russian master plan, as you can see. It really seems to be this this patchwork of actors, because, of course, the Russian state, even though it's been fairly hands-off on Africa so far, it has been involved. It has been involved in helping members of or elements of Prigozhin's networks to negotiate certain deals. So there is the Russian state, at least in the background, and of course, it can be assumed that certain areas in Africa will be of higher strategic relevance to the Kremlin than others. And in those areas, those semi-state actors will have less autonomy, or the Kremlin will have tighter strategic control, presumably. And if we view Russian power projection in Africa, or Russian activities in Africa, to frame it more neutrally, through the prism of the current Russian rulership architecture and of its shadow state, and view Russian activities in Africa more as power projection by that shadow state, or that unofficial element of the state, then a lot of the Russian priorities there, or a lot makes, or the picture makes somewhat more sense than to assume this grand Russian master plan that both voices in the US, but also the Russians, of course, with those leaked documents, seem to allude to at certain points. And regardless of how strong Russia is assumed to be, or how relevant and how influential Russia is assumed to be in certain African countries, power projection for the Russians always has to be achieved at low cost, and that, of course, will only be increasing with due to the fallout from the invasion of Ukraine. And this really leads me over to the uncertainty over Russia's future in Africa, or its involvement specifically. And of course, what should be mentioned here first is that a lot of this will be very localized. A lot of this will really depend on how local governments and local populations view Russian actions elsewhere, and how successful Russia can be at presenting its narratives and presenting itself as an alternative. And regarding the future of this involvement, there really are two archetypes, if you will. One of them would be the idea that Russia now, with this increased competition with NATO, or this increased rivalry with the West, might militarize its footprint in Africa, and while still presumably acting through mercenaries and other paramilitary groups, might increase strategic control and approach closer this model, or this idea of a master plan. However, on the other hand, of course, it can be argued that Russian resources will be hard pressed. For Russia, it may be increasingly difficult to present itself as a not alternative, but also competent power. In terms of the Wagner Group's counterterrorism credentials, they are not very stellar. So that is something that may start to be a bit of a problem for the Russians. And of course, there have been rumors of mercenaries having to be redeployed to Ukraine. So that really it really will likely be a spectrum of those two, between those two priorities. And so far it is too soon to tell, but we hope that we could provide some of the context to assess it going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of the presenters for a really fascinating paper. Context is everything, and a really thoughtful examination of the dynamics of Russia's involvement in Africa and what that means. For a formal response, we are going to turn to my co-editor, Dr. Samuel Ramani. Sam is an Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute and a tutor of politics at the University of Oxford, where he received his doctorate in March 2021. A specialist on Russian foreign policy, Samuel is a regular contributor to print media publications such as Foreign Policy and The Washington Post, and has advised government agencies such as the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the US Department of State, the French Ministry of Defense, NATO Intelligence Fusion Center, and US Department of Defense AFRICOM on issues pertaining to Russia, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Korea, and Afghanistan. His first two books, Russia in Africa and Putin's War on Ukraine, will be published by Oxford University Press and Hearst & Co. respectively in October 2022 and December 2022. Sam is also extremely active on Twitter and breaks news about the war as it happens. So Sam, over to you for a response to the paper by Allard and Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Steve, and also thank you for the excellent presentation and for this paper. Like, I broadly agree with most of the contentions that were laid out over here. I think that the way you started off with the debate as to whether Russia is a threat or not to African countries is particularly interesting, because the way I framed it in my book is that Russia is a virtual great power. Effectively, Russia is a power that is able to engage in a lot of pageantry, like it's got with the Sochi summit, with the ability to be convening power for 40 plus African leaders. It's got the ability, a lot of historical legacies that it can tap into. So it's got historical legitimacy as an established power on the continent. And it's quite proactive in high profile mining deals, military operations, arms deals, as well as soft power projects, particularly with regards to nuclear energy diplomacy and to a limited extent educational diplomacy and health diplomacy. But the foundations of its actual power are rather flimsy on all accounts. Its historical legacies and support may resonate at the elite level amongst those who have the generation of colonialism, but a soft power in Africa is maybe around 30 to 40% approval, whereas US and China routinely get 60 to 70%, according to Pew Global Research surveys. Its military interventions are similarly underwhelming. There's a lot of flash with the Wagner Group PMCs, but in the Central African Republic, in Mali, in Libya, they haven't really been able to change outcomes in a durable way. In Libya, they lost to the Turks. In Mali, they struggled to achieve any tangible successes. In CAR, they failed outside of Bangui at the very best, if you want to make the best case scenario. With regards to economic and trade deals, their trade presence is smaller than Turkey. In Sub-Saharan Africa, it's 1/3 of that of India. So we're looking at something that's with a lot of flash and a lot of the appearance of a great power, but not necessarily the substance of it. And I suspect that with the Ukraine war and with the 2023 St. Petersburg Russia-Africa summit, we'll see that chasm develop even more as secondary sanctions now restrict even their forays into arms sales. We're already seeing Egypt Su-35s be redirected potentially to Iran in exchange for drones. And we also see new projects, like maybe existing projects like Al-Dabaa nuclear reactor in Egypt might persist, but new projects are few and far between, even if they're being talked about in the natural gas sector in South Africa or from Morocco to Nigeria, that pipeline. These things all seem pretty illusory. And the loss of Ajakuta in Nigeria was another significant example. So I think that it's pretty interesting that when you use the typology at the start between Townsend and Martin and their two conflicting views, I think that Martin's view probably is the most persuasive of those two. But maybe it's an intersection of both, because Russia is a threat to governance in the region. It's a threat. It enables kleptocracy. It kind of it also promotes authoritarianism, corruption, and is now a force that sometimes they're backing both horses at once, like we saw in Central African Republic during the pre-2019 period, actually makes conflicts worse and more severe. So it's maybe Townsend's threat assessment and Martin's kind of competition view probably both can accord with each other. So that was interesting framing. Moving on to the historical legacies and what you tied together, I think that was very interesting as well. The Russians absolutely use the Soviet-era legacies as a way of consolidating their soft power, particularly their opposition to colonial rule, particularly their opposition to apartheid. And it was definitely striking that the BRICS summit in South Africa was where the Russia-Africa summit in Sochi, the brainchild that was created. And we also saw the leader of Angola there and the Russians talking about colonial legacies. And even now, they're framing their involvement in the Sahel, they're framing their involvement in Mali and Burkina Faso as a potential rivalry against Western neocolonialism. Assimi Goïta, a junta leader, or Ibrahim Traoré are seen as somehow these unlikely anti-colonial heroes. So the effective creation of and at least facilitation and capitalization on coups is very interesting. So that's a very important dynamic. another interesting dynamic that I think could be added to this discussion, instead of just going from Soviet era to current era, is to talk about the period in between, because so much of Russian scholarship on Africa ends with Gorbachev abandoning Mengistu and then revives itself again with the annexation of Crimea. And those 25 years in the middle get largely cut out from the perspective. We just assume that Russia's influence in Africa diminished in the 1990s, had an incremental revival under Vladimir Putin. But actually, during the mid to late 1990s, many of the core tenets of Russia's current Africa policy were developed and fashioned. And that's one thing that I just wanted to add to the discussion, was that we see, for example, Vladimir Lopatov. He had an article for International Affairs Moscow. He's a senior expert and researcher. And then Yevgeny Primakov, of course, coming up with the following ideas. Number one, opposition to Western norms and opposition to Western unilateral military interventions. That's just what we saw in Al-Shafa in Sudan, for example. And we saw a discussion about what second is like support for a multipolar order and engagement with African regional institutions and African regional powers, whether that be Yeltsin and Mandela talking about the Kosovo crisis, whether it be Russia engaging with the Organization of African Unity, the African Union, and other regional institutions underneath it, and debt forgiveness, which basically put the Soviet legacies and a lot of the Soviet era disputes aside, and with in the process sacrificed billions of dollars in hard currency in exchange for looking ahead, thinking about long-term strategy. And when you look at the fact that so much of consequential impact on Russia's Africa policy happened during those intervening years in the mid-1990s and late 1990s, when Russia's influence in Africa appeared to be at nadir and appeared to be at its weakest, we get the sense that Russia's policy in Africa has got a lot more consistency, a lot more strategic depth, and is not necessarily so tactical and opportunistic as is often portrayed in the Western media. So, and that means that I think that they have the ability to be more adaptable than we might think, be more flexible, even in the current constraints of their material resources coming from the Ukraine war. And that's something to watch if they continue those tactics going forward. So that was just another thing I wanted to add to this discussion, is that period in between, in those 25 years, gets neglected. And the framings that you have are very interesting, but I just wanted to add that. Moving down towards the other discussions topics that were discussed, with regards to patronage, with regards to Prigozhin, with regards to elite level politics and how that impacts Russian policy in Africa. I think that's you hit the nail on the head there. I think that's absolutely right. I think that with regards to the role of the Wagner Group, though, we're seeing it obviously transition and evolve with the Ukraine war. The Wagner Group has come out of the shadows, right, over the past 2 months. We've seen Yevgeny Prigozhin, who previously would sue authors like or think tank directors like the head of Bellingcat or reporters from The Guardian or other places for claiming that he's the head of the Wagner Group, now embrace his leadership of it and talk about how he turned the tide in Donetsk and Luhansk, and how then afterwards he moved and made these mercenaries into Russian national heroes. And he's gotten a Hero of Russia award for achieving this. So Prigozhin is using the Wagner Group now, not just as an instrument of the Russian state like it was before, but now as a vital element of his potential alternative power block to the Ministry of Defense. And we're seeing on Russian Telegram channels, obviously, fierce criticism of how Shoigu, as well as how some of his deputies, like Alexander Lapin, the head of the Central Military District, have handled the Ukraine war, either not targeting civilian infrastructure enough. Now, yesterday, they're targeting it too much and kind of creating a problem for cities that Russians should live in one day, or not mobilizing enough people or not doing enough stuff. It was interesting to see how that dynamic could change it. If now the Wagner Group is public, now that Prigozhin is presenting himself as a hardline critic of the Russian Ministry of Defense, is being so active in the Ukrainian theater, will that lead to Prigozhin and the Ministry of Defense having a turf war? Which side will Putin choose? And will Prigozhin eventually be a challenger to Putin someday in terms of creating an elite level politics network? And will the Wagner Group start making deals that in Africa that don't necessarily align with government policy? We're already seeing Wagner Group Telegram channels talk about a more assertive role in Burkina Faso than either Traoré or the Russian government have wanted to. And of course, when the Russians were putting all their efforts behind Haftar in Libya, Prigozhin was quietly trying to stage a coup to bring Saif Gaddafi in. When the Russians were behind Burhan in Sudan, Prigozhin was really trying to establish back channels with Hemeti. So we have to see the RSF chief. So we have to see how the role of the Wagner Group is changing. and whether patronage politics coming out of Russia is now becoming increasingly decentralized because of the fact that its main architect has become a very different figure in Russian politics in a short period of time. So that's just another set of questions that I want to bring in on that. And then I think absolutely discussions of Sudan, Central African Republic, the examples that were used empirically in the presentation were all very, very sound, very, very good. I think that the Syrian model certainly has played an important role for Russia in terms of counterinsurgency, but now they've also increasingly tried to develop a Central African model, which they now try to export in Mali. And we even saw some of the Mali junta protesters embrace that and discuss that before the Russians got involved there in a substantial way. And the Central African model obviously is very similar to the Syrian model because it combines work with an authoritarian state as an antidote to extremism. It combines diplomacy and also with the use of military force, though I think it's more force heavy than in Syria, where there's been consistent standard level processes. In Central African Republic, it seems as if we had the one-off Central African Opposition Alliance forming and not so much else after that. And also there's linguistic diplomacy that's being used. I mean, they're trying to push the Russian language in Kar, trying to push the Russian language in Syria. We've seen investments in soft power, vaccine diplomacy, food diplomacy, these type of things. Obviously, that's an interesting trend. And yeah, so I mean, is there a Central African model that's developing that's kind of independent from the Syrian model, customized for African conditions, or is Russia trying to transplant a strategy that is used in Syria to African theaters? And one of the things I'd like to note is that while Russia sells Syria, it sells the success of Assad, and notwithstanding the human rights abuses and all the war crimes that have come with it, it often gives Libya. It gives a temporary success, or at least a short-term movement forward, and then followed by a setback. So how sustainable is Russia's what Russia offers to the continent there, and how will that shape African public opinion going forward? And then I guess one last thing would be, how does all this tie together? How do Africans necessarily view these Russian tactics that are being used, the informal use of patronage, the enabling of corruption, and Russia's role on the continent? And what we've seen with the Ukraine war is something quite interesting. We've seen in countries where there's a history of French colonialism or neocolonialism interventions, as some people might see it, like Cote d'Ivoire or Mali, we see a lot of support, or at least some support for what Russia's doing in Ukraine, at least some sympathy for it. And we also see a trend in which Russia is recognized as a great power that we should work with, even if we don't like their tactics, we don't like their military aggression, their violation of sovereignty, their human rights abuses, their autocracy promotion. So there's that split screen. We don't like Russia, but we feel that they might be useful for us and we might need them. That seems to be the second trend that I've observed coming from this. So obviously, tying this back together is how resonant are these legacies at the popular level that we've just discussed over here, and how much are these tactics going to undermine their soft power, and how much has the Ukraine war changed that? So that's just another thing that kind of came up when I was listening to this presentation. So overall, a lot of interesting contributions here, and I just wanted to provide some extra context from my own research that might tie together with this.
Thanks so much, Sam. You really have a depth and breadth of knowledge on this, and thank you for those insights. So Martha wants to get the ball rolling, and she said she would like to ask Allard and Nicholas if they could comment on the linkages between African autocrats and Russian oligarchs. You say this is not state orchestrated. How independent would these linkages be should they begin to differ from Putin's agenda? And then we've also got a question asking what happens to the BRICS by an anonymous respondent. So over to you, Allard. Just put your camera on and your mic.
Good.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much also, Samuel, for your excellent comments. Can I respond first to Samuel's excellent comments, and then we'll respond to the questions. So I think, first of all, I would like to stress that I think Samuel's discussion, of course, is really excellent, and it actually shows exactly what we want to achieve with our paper. Really, using these three factors as a framework for discussion. And I think
Samuel pointing out additional relevant points within this framework is just I think really interesting, and I can also say that I'm really looking forward to your book. Just a couple of small points. So in terms of the framing, I completely agree with you of the paper that, you know, like this seems to be a paradox, but maybe not so much, right? So so one thing, yes, Russia, the economic capacity in Africa is quite small. The approval ratings might not be always great, but at the same time, there's this the elite approval by the likes of regime in Mali or Hemeti in Sudan with the rapid support forces. I mean, these are usually elite level deals. So on the one hand, it casts in on its ideational, you know, like his history. On the other hand, it really focuses on elite. So there are a couple of paradoxes, I think, which are quite interesting to explore. So I think, you know, in the South African context, of course, I think it's interesting that Jacob Zuma, for example, have military training in the Soviet Union, and this really allowed almost personal connections with Russia. And I think that's with regard to the first element we stress. Then I think one thing that is important to discuss is like how yes, Russia, maybe its achievements are quite small, but it is also very pragmatic. So there's a need to distinguish between, on the one hand, capacity, and on the other hand, what it has achieved so far. And also, I think there's much, and we don't necessarily have answers to this, but I think there's much to say still about what does Russia want to achieve in Africa? Is it instability? Is it influence? I think one thing you mentioned that's really relevant, of course, is the support for Russia, what's doing in Ukraine, or at least not no opposition. So there are all these different factors that I think are quite relevant. So Nicholas, do you have anything to add to what I just said?
No, I would probably give a quick answer to the question. I think it really depends, or I would very much agree with what Dr. Ramani said, that a lot of the Ukraine war and its internal dynamics in Moscow will also be determinant as to how Russia behaves in Africa, for example. I think that's the problem to some extent, that our article, of course, mostly talks about pre-2022, but now we are in a brave new world and we'll have to effectively wait and see. I think the spectrum that we allude to in our article, where on the one hand, at the one extreme end, you've got Russian networks, Russian political technologists helping elections, or helping people get elected, or in Madagascar, I think, which that doesn't really have anything to do with Russian strategic interests, but it brings Russia into the news, right? That was to some extent the explanation that was given for it. On the one hand, those semi-state or those private networks were rewarded with certain resource concessions, and for the Kremlin, Russia was in the news, and Russia appeared to be a player again, and that oligarch then got rewarded in the internal hierarchy of the Russian solar system, if you will. So that is the one extreme end. And then the other extreme end is something like the Libyan intervention, where you can assume that the Russian state has more control and more input than in those others. So I think that spectrum will still be valid to some extent, but to some extent, how the power structure in Russia shakes out over the next few months and how the war in Ukraine shakes out will determine to what extent Russia is able to conduct operations in Africa. And this is something where, again, this idea that on the one hand, Russia may have less resources available, and Dr. Ramani rightfully pointed out that secondary sanctions and diplomats being kicked out, etc., those sorts of things also have an impact on Russian state capacity. But Russia may be more or even less constrained by norms, and maybe even less constrained by what was previously deemed acceptable, if you will. So in that regard, I hope this somewhat answers the question. I think those will be the parameters that will determine how Russia behaves. And then, of course, it won't behave uniformly. and the Syrian model won't be viable for a while, but potentially the car model might. And lastly, or as a last comment, I think, again, as to what Dr. Rahmani said, facilitation of coups and potentially counter coups cultivated within national military and security forces may indeed be one of those levers that the Russians might be good at pulling in the future. So that may be just one element that we can observe more attempts certainly at.
Okay, a couple more.
If I may add,
Sure.
yeah, if I may add one answer to one question on whether I think the question was, is Russia willing or able to leverage on rising anti-French sentiment to expand its influence in West Africa? I think that's a very interesting question, and it's hard to answer this question, but what we do address in our paper is how Russia has used tries to influence anti-French sentiment in the Central African Republic. So it's very clear that Russia has invested, for example, in media outlets in the Central African Republic, and it's using Google AdWords campaigns to sort of privilege these media outlets in searches throughout Africa, and supposedly this has even resulted in the firing of one minister in the Central African Republic to really stir up and get rid of pro-French politicians and really trying to stir up anti-French sentiment. And this is done very subtle. So, for example, I was in the Eastern Congo last year, and I was watching Russia-sponsored television, and the commercial and the news items are quite good sometimes, but every now and then, very subtly, you encounter an anti-Western news item, and I think that can be quite influential.
Okay, thank you. A couple more questions, and then we're going to go on to the second presentation or the second panel. So Gustavo de Carvalho, who works with me, said, "Thank you for the great presentations. I was wondering if you could explore the difficulties in providing clear positions regarding Russia, especially after the Ukraine war. In particular, it would be great to see what you think regarding how African states can avoid being instrumentalized in global geopolitical challenges. In other words, how can they, Africa is seen as a theater. How do we go back to Africa being an actor, not a site for other powers' struggles?" And then from Sef Ashiagbor from NDI, "Thanks for the great presentation. Steve started with the 3 Fs, and then we moved on to the more direct aspects of Russia's engagement. How do panelists see the interactions between these two, the 3 Fs, food, fertilizer, and fuel, and other aspects of Russia's involvement playing out in the coming years?" So I don't know who would like to take that. Maybe we can start with Nicholas.
So I can speak.
Okay, go ahead.
To Gustavo's question, maybe, as Nicholas, you can do the second one. Is that okay? So I think I would say it's quite challenging. So I think, of course, we have the Cold War, where we could look how the power struggle played out on the continent, and unfortunately, I wish it was different, but unfortunately, I think we can see that usually interest of African states trumped Africa taking ownership and trying to shield itself from these external influences. So that's, I think, the reality I have to deal with. But at the same time, there was this sort of paradox in Africa, where on the one hand, these interests of states made it possible for superpowers to get involved in Africa. At the same time, of course, there was also a strong norm of non-alignment and anti-imperialism. And I think, so my answer would be, it's not easy, but I think it's really important for Africa and African international organizations to really keep stressing this normal sort of trying to stay out of, or shield itself from these type of influences and not get involved.
Great, thank you. Nicholas?
I think to some extent that will really depend on how it's mediated on national and regional levels. I'm afraid I can't really give a uniform answer to it. I think a lot of it will depend on what regions get affected the most by the aftershocks of the invasion. For example, it will depend on how Russia manages to, as we alluded to play its cards in terms of information operations, as it's often called, etc. But it also depends on how the West or how Western countries position themselves, and this probably attaches to some extent to the previous question. I think if those African countries that are that are being made to feel the fallout from the invasion will be treated like a theater, as you mentioned, then perhaps they will be more amenable to the Russian position at the diplomatic level. So again, I'm afraid I can't give a uniform long-term answer to that, but those would be the parameters, I would say.
I know Sam has got to run to another meeting, unfortunately. Sam, I don't know if you have if you're still with us. I think he's already gone. Martha, I think I'm going to hand over to you for the second panel, and then we'll have time after that to revisit some of these questions. People can ask these panelists further questions, and we would then close. But we'll have a good time for a good time period for questions.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Alo. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Steve. And Sam, in absence, we'll thank him later. I would like to now introduce the second panel, which in fact is one speaker, but then we will have Kaylee Clifford responding. Dr. Bazo Nzenze is our speaker. His paper has focused on what he calls a differentiated courtship, examining a regime type analysis of Russia's Southern African arms trade. So he looks at trade as a whole and then arms trade within that for the period 2012 to 2019. Just to introduce you to Bazo as the speaker, he is an associate professor at the University of Johannesburg, where he is also the head of Department for Politics and International Relations. He has published on the subject of artificial intelligence and emerging technologies in IR, as well as the BRICS order, wondering if that is assertive or complementing the West, and the political economy of Sino-South African trade and regional competition. The previous exploration he made into the topic that he'll be talking about today was a systematic study of South African-Russian trade relations under the coinciding presidencies of Thabo Mbeki and Vladimir Putin between 1999 and 2008. That was in the journal Strategic Review for Southern Africa. Bazo, over to you. We look forward to hearing the findings of your paper.
Thank you very much, Martha, and greetings to you and everyone who is with us today, and special thanks to yourself and your team, as well as the guest editors, Stephen, Kaylee, and Sam, for the very kind invitation for working with me and my co-author over the past number of months, really. And we both feel very honored to be one of 8 papers that will be in this special issue. And I can only imagine the avalanche of submissions that you would have received on an issue on Russia-Africa relations in the year 2022, especially. So I want to thank yourselves and the anonymous peer reviewers for your generosity in taking the time to probe the paper and going through it and bringing up a lot of things for us to consider and really pay attention to. So the paper, as Martha has laid out, I can switch off my camera. The paper, as you've laid out, Martha, is an exploration to Russia's arms trade with general and arms trade with countries, particularly in SADC in Southern Africa, and we look at 16 case studies. And we begin really with the recognition that trade is political and that it is conditioned by interests, by histories, by relations, and we argue that by regime type as well. and that this is one of the factors that determines the nature and direction and the contents of what is being traded. So the title of our paper is A Differentiated Courtship, ? A regime type analysis of Russia's African arms trade. And, having finished the paper, we would comfortably remove the question mark. But of course, still do read the paper. But our findings, as I will share, are that there appears to be a differentiated courtship between Russia and authoritarian as well as hybrid regimes when it comes to arms trade and trade in general. So the way I'm going to proceed is threefold. First, I'll give an overview very briefly of the research, what questions guided us, or what question on the main guided us, and how we went about answering it. And then I will share answers to that question, and then say a little bit about the implications of our findings and areas or directions for future research. So I am wondering, Chair, if you can see my screen. I seem to see your screen.
Basil, Maxine has in fact shared your PowerPoint, so you can see on the screen.
Okay.
Go on, Maxine.
Okay, let me try and share again from my side.
Okay.
Can you see now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So the question that guides us is whether, let me just read it verbatim, does Russia trade more generally and with regards to arms specifically with democracies or with authoritarian and hybrid regimes in Southern Africa? So we want to unpack Russia's trade with the region in general, and then we want to look at the particular class of products that are classified as armaments and ammunitions. The time of focus is 2012 to 2019. We went for this timeline because it was pre-COVID. The potential noise that, statistically speaking, that would, and some outliers that might emerge as a result of COVID made us to restrict ourselves to 2019. But the period between 2012 and 2019 is, of course, very interesting on its own in the history or the recent history of Russia-Africa relations, because 2012 is when Vladimir Putin got his second presidency, assumed his second presidency, and in 2019 he hosted the Sochi summit. The article seeks to bridge or to test and see which of the two among the literatures applies in this case. On the one hand, there's a view that in the wake of the World Trade Organization, the world as a whole is liberalizing. Countries are trading with each other more generally, regardless of regime type. And on the other hand, there is another literature that argues that regime type still matters in trade deals, especially in trade of arms. You can think of sanctions as well as ratifications of trade deals where legislatures have an input. They tend to be more willing to ratify trade agreements that have been concluded with fellow democracies. The data that we use is from the United Nations trade map, and our classification mechanism is in terms of regime type, is the Economist Intelligence Unit index, democracy index. And of course, there are immediately problems with either of these data sources. On the one hand, we know of the fact that we don't fully know the scope of the entirety of arms trade because of the nature of the product or set of products. And also, of course, there are debates about what constitutes a democracy and the methodologies used to classify countries as democratic or hybrid or authoritarian. There are problems there as well. But we use these because of their transparency. We can problematize them, but I think functionally they serve their purpose. Until something perhaps much more better and universally adopted comes along, these made sense. The study then seeks to, based on the question, seeks to determine both the magnitude, how much is being traded, as well as the direction of the rate of growth of Russia's regime type trade with 16 SADC countries, and therefore determining the trajectory of trade per regime type over this 7-year period. So, in a nutshell, the findings indicate that there is indeed a differentiated courtship, and I will speak to this in the following slides. What we found was that Russia's overall trade was concentrated among democracies in the region for the period under study. So this is general trade. We haven't isolated arms trade, followed by authoritarians, and then followed by by hybrid regimes. The arms trade, however, would seem to be more concentrated among the democracies, but that is because democracies on the main also account for a higher proportion of the region's GDP, proportionally and just generally speaking. And the next group is the authoritarian regimes, mainly due to Angola. And then despite democratic regimes representing the bulk of the region's buying power, so 58% in terms of GDP, hybrid and authoritarian regimes appeared to have a disproportionate share of Russian trade overall, because they represent about 46% the arms trade in particular is a little bit above these two regimes' share of the overall regional GDP. And so they are a little bit in terms of, they're a little bit of overachievers in terms of buying Russian arms, although their general purchases of Russian products generally is in step with their shares of regional GDP. Interestingly then, hybrid regimes were more likely as a group to purchase Russian arms. So as it might be only a few countries that are in the authoritarian category or in the democratic category that purchase Russian arms to begin with, most of hybrid regimes, regardless of the amount, these countries were likely to, at some point or another, over the 7-year period and consistently, were more likely to purchase Russian arms. So a total of 60% of those countries that are classified as hybrid regimes bought Russian arms at some point in the period under study, whereas only 40% of democracies and 33% of authoritarian regimes made this type of purchase. And further pointing to a differentiated courtship is the fact that hybrid regimes overall in the 7-year period, their general trade with Russia was declining, but their arms trade was growing. So this points again to a differentiated courtship. On the question of who's courting whom, it would seem to us, at least, that it is the hybrid regimes that are looking to Russia to purchase as a source of these weapons, because they also purchase from other sources in terms of these arms. And then Russia's trade with Southern African countries exhibited the highest growth with regimes that are classified as hybrid or authoritarian. So they are growing by upwards of 360%, 369.4% to be specific. Trade between Russia and authoritarian regimes in particular, I'm referring here to, because the hybrid regimes have actually overall been declining. But overall trade between Russia and Southern African countries, the growth seems to be most evident with authoritarian regimes. Again, they're growing by 369.4%. Democracy is not too far behind, by the way, at 231%, if you compare 2012 and 2019. So as a way of concluding and reflecting on the findings, we just want to note mainly 2 points. The first is that there is an arising question here, which basically points to the tenuous nature of hybrid regimes, and perhaps that is why they are procuring so much arms in general, compared to the other regime types, which tend to be stable, either in an authoritarian way or through stable democratic institutions. But hybrid regimes are understood to generally be in transition, either backsliding into authoritarianism or towards democratization. And so in this regard, we think future work could link this trend to the direction of each individual country's improvement or decline in its democratic scores, because this would enlighten us further as to whether Russia is having more relations and courting countries as they become more democratic or as they become authoritarian, one way or the other. And perhaps through a very precise methodology, there could be an investigation of whether there is a direct influence from Russia or any other external player, for that matter. And so it is clear, and I say this because it is clear from the analysis that the hybrid regimes on the continent source the bulk of their weapons elsewhere. So they are not the biggest buyers of Russia's weapons. Russia is not their leading supplier, these hybrid regimes, but these regimes are more likely than the other two to be purchasing Russian weapons. And so the question here is, China, Germany, France, and the US, they come out as the other notable suppliers. And so the question here again is, who is courting whom, when, and for what purposes? Of course, each country is unique. We pay attention to this in the individual case studies that make up the paper. And so by way of acknowledgement, I'd like to thank my co-author and PhD student, Zimkhitha Manyana, who I believe is in the audience. I want to thank Dr. Martha Bridgman and Dr. Maxine Rubin, very patient editors, and of course the special issue editors, Stephen, Kaylee, and Samuel, and great to see all of you here today, and our African War Lab team at the University of Johannesburg, whom I think are also represented here. So thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Basil. Thank you. I would like to open the floor for questions while we have a response from Ms. Kaylee Clifford, whom I will introduce now. Thank you, Basil, for putting on your camera. It is nice to see your face while you answer. So if I can just read the brief bio, which participants may have seen in the introductory material. Kaylee Clifford, in fact, was with SIA in the Russian African program when we began this sojourn of a special issue, and she was very helpful in just getting questions generated and thinking about the concept note. But today she is the Deputy Chief Editor at Africa Check, which is the continent's leading fact-checking organization. And she holds a first-class master's degree in international relations from the University of the Witwatersrand. And she is going to be responding now to Basil Nzenze's paper, but also throwing light on the wider questions that the special issue brought up. Thank you, Kaylee.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you also to Alad, Niklaus, and Basil for giving us a taste of two of the papers that are included in this special issue. In the next few minutes, I'm going to respond to some of the themes raised and also talk more generally about Russia-Africa ahead of the second Q&A session. I think it's made a lot of sense to start this conversation by placing Russia's return to Africa in a historical context. Of course, depending on who you are talking to, some will say that Russia never left Africa. But this history is important. It goes a long way in understanding Russia's relations with Africa today. And this could not have been more clearly highlighted by some African countries' response to the war in Ukraine. Many were surprised, disappointed, even angry when a number of African countries did not publicly condemn Russia for its aggression in Ukraine. But when we look at Africa's response in context, the sense of loyalty that many African leaders feel towards the former Soviet Union as a country that supported a number of African countries in their liberation movements, as a country that did not participate in the colonization of Africa, as a country that many African leaders were educated in, the patronage networks that have been pointed out, the ideological alignments and the shared foreign policy values, perhaps Africa's response begins to make a little bit more sense. What is true is that the Putin regime has placed a focus on renewing relations in Africa. Putin has actually named Africa as a foreign policy priority for Russia. We know, for example, that since 2006, promises of investment have been made, billions of dollars in debt has been written off, diplomatic links have increased, strategic partnership agreements have been signed, there have been lucrative mining and nuclear energy contracts secured. And then, of course, there was the inaugural Russia-Africa Summit in 2019, attended by 43 African heads of state, which is not exactly a small number. The topic of trade is an interesting aspect of Russia-Africa relations because while Russia's influence in Africa is expanding, trade levels remain relatively low when we compare with countries like Turkey or India. But when we zoom into the arms trade, as Basil's presentation has showed, the picture is perhaps a little bit different. We know that Russia has signed military agreements with over 20 African countries, and that Russia exports more arms to Africa than the US, France, and China combined. So the arms trade is a key sector for Russia in Africa, but is it a key sector for Africa looking to Russia? As Basil showed, that perhaps is up for debate. And this broader theme of Russia-Africa security relations features throughout the special issue. So all of this has led to quite a bit of concern around the return of the bear. What does Russia want from Africa and what's driving its interest? I think international sanctions are a major driver and will continue to be in the wake of the war. Access to natural resources and supporting the development of energy projects are other strategic goals. And then more broadly speaking, I think it's safe to say Russia is looking to Africa as a region in which it can project power and influence to say, look, we do still have partners in other parts of the globe. Some of this concern is warranted. There is no doubt that some of Russia's influence in Africa can be described as malign, especially when we think about attempts to control the narrative through state-sponsored media and through disinformation campaigns, instances of what looks like election interference. But does this mean that Russia has a clear Africa strategy? I think that as the authors here today have shown, much of it has actually been the result of opportunism. The Kremlin's foreign policy is more responsive to events and opportunities rather than being the result of an organized plan. So there is this loose strategy guided by some broad goals, but importantly, the actual engagement is carried out not only by state actors, but also by state-backed conglomerates and politically connected private businesses. There are a number of examples that we have highlighted in the introduction to the special issue that point to Russia actually having quite a shaky foundation in Africa. Wagner PMCs involved in alleged war crimes in Libya and the CAR, Russia's support for authoritarian regimes on the continent, a failed COVID-19 vaccine distribution campaign. These have all eroded Russia's soft power in Africa. And when we look at the level of cooperation compared with Africa's more traditional partners, France, the UK, the US, China. One might argue that Russia has little to show for its efforts in Africa. What we do know is that Russia tends to thrive in environments where the rules are fluid, and it's not afraid to make mistakes. This tells us that Russia's presence on the continent presents both risks and opportunities for Africa. And I say Africa while also being aware that we're talking here about a continent of many, many individual states, each with their own priorities, their own terms of engagement. And so we can't adopt a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to understanding Russian engagement on the continent. It's why I'm glad that this special issue includes articles that touch on specific regions and specific contexts. But I'm also interested to hear from the authors here today, and indeed from the audience, on just how much agency Africa has in this conversation. And hopefully that will get us closer to answering this important question of who is courting whom. Thanks, Martha. I'll hand over back to you now.
Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you for that roundup and for responding also to Basil's paper. I think that there is much more to unpack there. I'm hoping to see in the question time. I would like to just thank both of you for your interventions and hand back over to Steve, who will be chairing the Q&A for the remainder of our time together.
Thank you, Martha. So Basil, some of the questions, three people have asked, can you tell us who is who? Which are the democracies, which are the hybrid regimes, and which are the autocracies in your classification? And then a follow-up question from Dr. Gordon Moyo in Zimbabwe. Generally speaking, military budgets in autocracies are not publicly declared. Does your paper acknowledge that perhaps in reality, arms trade between autocracies and the Kremlin may be far higher than the publicly available figures? And I wonder, just if I can add there, would we have seen something different in the last 3 years? Your data stopped in 2019. What could you surmise might have been the what's happened since Sochi? Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And yes, I did quite anticipate this kind of question about who is classified as what. It's a very debatable space. But as I said, functionally, we all have to agree on some things. And so the regimes that are classified as authoritarian in the paper, based on the index that we used, are Angola, Comoros, the DRC, Eswatini, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. And the democracies are Botswana, Lesotho, Mauritius, Namibia, and South Africa. And then finally, as a hybrid, we have Madagascar, Malawi, Tanzania, Zambia, and the Seychelles, which incidentally was not on the index. And so we had to triangulate here and put a note that we actually used Freedom House, which classified the Seychelles as partly free. The point about authoritarians not being upfront with their budgets, military budgets, is well taken. And this was again part of my caveat at the beginning, that we are working with data that is publicly available. For the scope of this paper and for the purposes of the analysis, what we had to use was the UN data, trade data, which is available. But already there, the picture is quite clear that the hybrid regimes do the most buying of arms. It might then, as a hypothesis, be the case that they buy higher than what is publicly available. The authoritarians are mostly dominated by Angola. It might be that there are other regimes, but already the authoritarian regimes, as a proportion of their buying power, of the total buying power of the region, they are above by about 2% of what their buying power predicts. So they buy disproportionately, not by much, but by a noticeable percentage more than their buying power would predict. And then on the question of what we might have seen in the past, 2 years, 2020, 2021, because 2022 is still ongoing. I would think that perhaps Mozambique, so the fight there against the counterterrorism efforts, which have become more pronounced, which might perhaps mean that the region as a whole is arming up. I would predict that the authoritarians might be purchasing more than is presently the case, because, as I said, the democracies tend to be more stable in the region. There was an interesting trend in the early COVID of less conflict because of the pronounced presence of the state across Africa. But of course, I'm not quite sure how that might have played out in the Southern African region. I have some ideas in the Horn of Africa as well, because of the what's happening in the Horn with the Tigray war. But we've restricted ourselves to Southern Africa, and so I would anticipate perhaps Mozambique to have procured more arms than was previously the case. I hope I've addressed at least part of your question.
Yes,
Stephen.
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Future paper, certainly.
You see, a good academic always lays the ground for the next paper. Irina Filatova asks, speaking of the historical context, why do you think that Ukraine is not seen as a legitimate successor of the USSR in terms of assistance to the liberation movements, just as Russia was? So I think I'm going to ask Allard and, let me just move this, sorry. Allard and Nicholas, if they might hazard an answer to that. Allard?
I think it's a great question, and we thought about this as well. We don't really have a clear answer to this, actually. It's a really good question. It's just clear that it is not perceived, but the why, that's quite hard to say. I can only speculate that I might assume that most of the African interlocutors of this during Soviet times were brought to Moscow. But this is just pure speculation. I think it's a really important and interesting question, actually.
Okay, Nicholas?
Similarly, something that I'm not familiar with how the history of the Soviet Union was discussed in Africa over the past 30 years, to be honest. So what I could only speculate is that similar to Western anti-imperialist discourse, there is a bit of an overlap between Russia and the Soviet Union after the war, of course. In Europe, it's also an issue for Ukraine and supporters of Ukraine that people of certain political persuasions still view Russia as a legitimate vanguard of liberation to some extent, and that this cancels out the former Soviet republics. Whether that is the same in African political discourse, I couldn't say.
Thank you. I mean, I might just add in here that I think Russia hasn't left that to chance. I think Russia has invested in image building and saying we are the successor to the Soviet Union. They assumed the Soviet Union's Security Council seat in no time at all, and has been very effective in their information, disinformation, in their building of the brand. That and there's a nostalgia in Africa for this to be the case. But absolutely, some liberation movement fighters were trained in Odessa and other places in Ukraine. I think Russia's probably just done a better job of claiming that history and using it for its own ends. There's another question from Gordon Moyo, which is going to go back to Bassel, who is welcome to also answer the question about the image building. That criminal gangs and some other insurgency groups may maybe not in the SADC region, but across the continent, inordinately use AK-47 rifles from Russia. Is there a way of understanding this underground arms trade? Baso?
Sure. So this is a very important layer because arms trade is a very layered phenomenon. Andrew Feinstein wrote a very big book about it called the Shadow World. And there is certainly a lot of arms dumping. I noticed that you mentioned the AK-47 in particular, and that of course is a very old model of gun. So this is by definition quite difficult to follow. And our paper in this regard is very modest. But I will say, as modest as it is, even through the official trade data, there already emerges a trend, a very clear trend, that most of the arms, proportionally speaking, are procured by in terms of frequency, by hybrid regimes, and a little bit above their purchasing power by authoritarian regimes. The phenomenon of underground trade, I think, is a bit difficult to answer at this point, but I would also point you to a paper by Theo Nithling in the South African Strategic Review for Southern Africa that might prove useful. But on the question of why has Russia become the successor of the Soviet Union, I think, Stephen, you actually made all the points that I wanted to make, because this was something I also wrote about it, I think in March, in one of the local papers, the Mail and Guardian, where basically, I was pinpointing this and the problems that emerge when you assume a natural alliance with Russia. It limits your foreign policy room for maneuver. But I think it has been successful because, as you rightly put it, it did not leave anything to chance. It used the fact that it was a successor of Russia or of the USSR in the Security Council. It assumed the debt that the Soviet Union had, and you could say comparatively, it had more resources to utilize to at least maintain a presence on the continent. And of course, the anti-West, anti-NATO position seems to resonate. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question comes from Peter Fabricius, and I'm also going to combine it with Gustavo's earlier question. Peter says, is it really advisable for African countries to remain neutral in the Russia-Western standoff when, for example, in Mali, being neutral between them also means being neutral on military juntas versus democracy? Baso, I don't know if you want to take that first, and then we'll circle back to Nicholas and Allard.
So let me see if I understand at least the first part of the question on the advisability of African countries remaining neutral in the Russia-Western standoff. Look, I think there's no easy answer either way. The events of February showcased that, at a minimum, the world is going back to interstate conflict, and we're going to see more of this. There's already been also intensifications in Central Asia, and so I don't quite know what non-neutrality means or what the policy options are. But I would say maybe moving a little bit away from the binary of neutral and non-neutral might be a useful policy position to take, because what you always want is that room for maneuver in foreign policy making. And so when you are tilted one way or the other, especially when you are Africa, I think there's a unique opportunity to take advantage of the changing world order, and in fact to boost the African economy, because other regions have been doing the same when there are conflicts on the continent, take advantage in terms of the instability in the DRC, to get minerals on the cheap. And I think this presents, someone is going to take the opportunity, and this presents Africa, especially the energy suppliers, the opportunity to utilize the changing situation and to use it, frankly, as a bargaining chip, because other regions, other players have done the same when Africa has been in tatters. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicholas.
Quite frankly, I don't think I'm in a position to give African countries policy advice on how to deal with the fallout from the invasion. I think Dr. Nsenzi already made valuable points, and I think it's too differentiated to give a uniform answer.
Okay. Alad, are you going to answer or pass?
Yeah, no, it's the same for Nicholas.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question by Dylan Craig. And I'll address this to you, Basil, first. Do we have any examples of states that have substantially transferred their arms purchasing destination from other countries to Russia in the last decade? Or are today's buyers largely the same as yesterday's?
Good question. So for our region of interest, there actually was not any substantial switch in terms of the procuring. In other words, well, there were new customers, if you will, for Russia, but on the main, the growth has been consistent throughout. There hasn't been a switching one way or the other. The Russian supplies have grown, but so has the supplies from other parts of the world. But I do understand in other regions, particularly North Africa, I know Algeria is probably the largest purchaser of importer of Russian arms. But I think it also links, if I can take the liberty, Stephen, I saw a question about competition between Beijing and the Kremlin in supplying not just arms, but also tactics to the SADC region. And this is a very interesting dilemma that Russia is actually in, because a lot of Russian technology is sent to China for manufacture or for sale, and is counter-manufactured or duplicated in no time at all. This is so much focus has been on the US-China trade war, but there's a quiet trade war, especially since 2014, between Russia and China because of the sanctions on Russia, where Russia finds that the only major customer that it actually has is Beijing, but it's stuck in a dilemma because the arms that it sends there and other equipment, fighter jets, and so on, and other technologies are very quickly reverse engineered, and new versions of these are brought. But African countries have, as far as this research has found, have been purchasing not too much of the, at least Southern Africa, not too much of the cutting edge technology. It's still, bombs and guns on the main, and other equipment, but nothing really on the cutting edge. Thanks.
Hey, thank you very much. An anonymous attendee asked a little bit earlier, and I skipped over this one, but I think it's a very interesting question. How do Africans see their interests in their relations with Russia, taking into account the violation of fundamental international law by invading Ukraine? Basil, you can start with that one.
I'll actually skip this one. I think there is a very detailed paper in the issue that might have something to say about this, but not ours.
Okay, no problem. I'll unless Nicholas and Alad want to intervene, I'm going to actually ask Kaylee what she thinks about this. And then you're going to also help me chair. I know you disappeared for a few minutes, Kaylee. How do Africans see their interests in their relations with Russia, taking into account the violation of fundamental international law by invading Ukraine?
Thanks, Steve. I'm struggling a bit with my connection, but I hope that you.
Oops, we lost her. Hopefully she'll join us. Sorry, I just see she's dropped off. Okay, are there any other questions? I think most of these have been covered. Oh, there was a question of, do we think that we will see an expansion of Russian influence in West Africa, given the anti-French sentiment which Russia is really playing on? We've seen photographs and videos of people coming out into the street with pictures of President Putin and Russian flags. And some of those countries have also been subject to coups or attempted coups. There's a belt of instability in the north, which ISIS and other extremist groups have been exploiting. It's you know, you have a different kind of conflict in Cameroon. You know, is Russia going to be able to capitalize on the anti-French sentiment in that part of the world? If you were to project a little bit further forward, who'd like to take that one?
Maybe just one comment about that. I think a lot of it depends also how Western government position themselves in regard to Russia in this area, and especially in terms of how, if we talk about France, I'm not sure to what extent, or it seems a bit like Paris hasn't understood how unpopular it is in certain parts of Western Africa, given the way the government's official pronouncements have been in the wake of Wagner being invited. If that changes, then maybe that closes a flank that Russia can exploit. But again, that is just that is a bit speculative. But I think that's also part of the equation to some extent.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, here's a very good question from Dr. Sabo Robert at Bingham University in Nigeria. Why are most Africans sympathetic to Russia over sanctions compared to their Ukraine intervention? So, you know, how is that message? Well, do we know that for a fact? You know, how do we know what the African street is feeling and thinking? I don't know how much polling has been done. We've actually got a new paper coming out in a couple of weeks' time with an examination of public sentiment in Mali and Sudan on social media. And again, social media is a small subset of what the people are really saying. But, you know, why do we think the sanctions argument seems to have gained ground and is finding fertile soil in Africa? Basil, do you want to have a go at that? And I see Martha wants to come in, so we might want to wrap a bit earlier than we thought we might. Go ahead, Basil.
Sure. Yeah, let me agree that we are not very aware on. I look forward to the report, the paper that you're working on that's going to come out on this. We live in a viral age, in the age of virality and of pictures and of Twitter. And certainly one of the early trends that we saw, the most viral videos, were of Africans being treated in a particular way that could be considered discriminatory, along with Indians, people of Indian citizenship who were in Ukraine, and that played right into Russia's favor. And of course, the groundwork had been prepared all along because Russia has had greater visibility on the continent. Let me also caution that there is, of course, split opinion on this. People have wide-ranging views. But I can say also one of the things that I'm finding, and of course you might classify this as informal polling, there is, I think, a kind of resonance to Putin's decisiveness as a leader that then many people observing on the continent, and again, this is just from discussions with people, that kind of quote decisive leadership and that people have not seen on the part of their leaders in terms of what Putin has done. And so some people are perhaps living vicariously through, at least in the early phase of the conflict, when Russia seems to have the momentum. I don't know how much that might still be the case today. So I think lots of reasons, some sociological, and some to do with information and misinformation.
Yeah, I think Russia gets a free pass because there've been many racist incidents in Russia as well. So, but I think, as you said, Russia prepared the ground, and it also had these narratives of the Ukrainians being Nazis and so forth, and that played very, very well into their narrative. Martha, I think I'm going to end off here.
I wanted to address two of the questions because having just read all the papers, I can bring some of the insights. I have the benefit of having been exposed to all the thinking. And two of the papers speak very much to the perception of Russia in Africa and also Russia's attempts at shaping that perception. One by a group of Russian academics who actually went into Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso and did a survey of nearly 500 very carefully sampled youth, and then spoke to various thought leaders in those societies. And the overwhelming sense within Mali is a very pro-Russian perspective. And that is 80% of Malians surveyed thought that Russia was a good thing for their country. And so it's a fascinating paper from the point of view why that is and what elements of Russia's involvement has been so positive in their perspective and maybe in comparison to the French. And this speaks to the Ukrainian question, is that one of the points brought up by an academic in, I think, Niger, it was that the French were starting to push an agenda whereby there were discussions with the insurgents about secessionism and about even a semi-autonomous region within Mali. And the Malian and Nigerian governments felt very threatened by this, that an external power could come and begin to talk about carving up their countries. And the whole the Dursma Masur paper actually points out really fascinatingly this shift from looking at the human rights and liberal democracy narrative over to protecting state sovereignty. And you might find that a terrible conflict, but I believe they've been able to propagate the idea that Ukraine is actually part of Russia and that it is not a sovereign state. And that's why their intervention, their engagement there is all about holding together the Russian people. And that somehow resonates with states in West Africa, at least according to the SIF paper. The other paper looks at Sputnik and RT and the amazing ability of those platforms to spread information. And Steve, your excellent talk on the SIA website about their ability to use local African stories to get the attention of listeners and then to also put them through a Russian lens. Very powerful. So those two papers in the lineup would be worth visiting if you are curious about those questions.
Martha, can you tell us?
I'll stop there and let you close, Steve.
Okay. Can you tell us, just remind us again where we find these papers and how we get hold of them?
Sure. So the Taylor and Francis website has a page for the South African Journal of International Affairs. Any one interested can, of course, email Maxine or I, and we can send you the link. But it's on Twitter. It's easy to Google Sajia. The paper by Dursma and Masur is already out. It's open access. If you Google Russia's return to Africa. And then the words patronage, opportunism, you'll probably hit that paper. And so that is there. SIF has been loaded. We are running a few free to view until the end of the year. So it's worth going on the Taylor and Francis site, even if you don't have access to university linkages or your own subscription, those papers will be available. I would be happy to post, maybe I could ask Maxine, she has posted in the chat box the linkage or the URL for the various papers that are already out.
I like to think of
where we start.
Maxine.
Papers are being released as they come through proofs, and the whole issue should be out in December.
Thank you. And just once again to thank all of our presenters, our respondents, and the audience. I think it's been really great. We've had some fantastic questions. I've learned a lot during this process. Thank you, Martha, for your patience, and Maxine for all of your very diligent work. We've enjoyed today's discussion. Please read the papers, and we look forward to the next time. Thank you very, very much. And thanks also to the SciAS technical team, Ndumi, Sarasa, for really helping us. And the amazing thing is that the line from Lagos was probably better than the line from Joburg, because we lost Kaylee along the way. So
yes, well, we might have load shedding in Johannesburg.
Yes.
So who knows? The
Cool.
euphemism for power outages here. I wanted to especially thank Maxine. She has been instrumental, my assistant editor, in keeping us all on the same page and moving the issue forward. So thank you, Dr. Maxine Rubin, for your help. And thank you to all the authors for persevering through the language editing process. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks. Well, that's it.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.